Hello everybody and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Balecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, or it's a rejoinder episode, or it's a bonus episode, which this is. This is a conversation between Laura Paul and Alissa Hattman. Laura first interviewed Alissa for a Seattle book event last September, and it went so well that they wanted to talk more. They recorded this interview back in October at the tail end of the book tour for Alissa's book Sift, and Laura's a friend of mine. She sent me the interview and I said, oh, that should go on my podcast. And she agreed, so here we are. Laura Paul is a writer and artist who has been published in the Brooklyn Rail, Los Angeles Review of Books, the Comics Journal Minor Literatures, Tarpaulin Sky Magazine, and other outlets. She holds a master's in media studies from UCLA and a bachelor's degree in comparative history of ideas from the University of Washington. She works for the publisher Sublunary Editions and the independent book distributor Asterism Books. Her website is laurapaulwriter.com. She's on Instagram at Laura_N_Paul. She also has a really good poetry manuscript that's looking for a home. Also, Alissa Hattman is the author of the novel Sift, which engages with themes of ecological grief and climate repair. Her writing has appeared in The Rumpus, Carve, The Gravity of the Things, Propeller, Big Other, Shirley Magazine, Mayday, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA in fiction from Pacific University and an MA in English literature from Portland State University. She has worked as a fiction editor, book reviewer, zine librarian, writing group facilitator, and teacher. She is originally from North Dakota. She now lives and teaches in the Pacific Northwest. More can be found at AlissaHattman.com, and all those links will be in the show notes as well. Also, this interview is structured a little bit differently. There's going to be a reading, and then the conversation, and then some more reading. So let's get into it.
Sift 1. I thought that being inside would protect me, with its corners and its curtains. Then a kindness took me by the throat and stretched me, taut against the sky, beaming. And I found something more valuable than protection. If only you could have seen it, Mother. What light. The driver arrived with a crate, and inside the crate were the last of the winter squashes, butternut, acorn, kabocha, sweet dumpling. It had been ages since I'd eaten food from a vine, and I had so many questions, concerns. The driver listened. Then she said the best way to prepare kabocha was to cut out the insides and fill it with stars. I blushed and grew old with her, right there in the smoggy sunlight. Long story short, I left with her mother. I went outside. Here's another way to say it. I gathered up all that you gave me and bolted, escaped into the toxic air with the only person I'd met who had learned how to keep living. I remember blackened fields and a sky the color of cantaloupe. The air was full of smoke, but inside the vehicle, with its systems and its filters, we could breathe freely. I watched the flickering red skies turn into plumes of dark blue, and the plumes of dark blue turn into rain, and the rain turn into puddles, and the puddles turn into ice, and the ice turn back into puddles, and the puddles into air. Certain cycles, flows. Observing is one way to go on. The driver and I shared the same road, the same vehicle, but we were both following the uneven edges inside our own minds. Hours dripped into the chasm between us. Occasionally, I found courage enough to choke out a thought even though my throat was so thirsty. The driver was kind. She taught me how to sift, to sip water from the air. Stay very still, she said. Listen to everything thrumming. Inside too. You feel it? Sometimes I think about how far I am from my abandoned home, how this becoming has made me less animal and more vegetal. And when I think about this, I think of you, Mother, and wonder whether you would have lived this way too, had you known it was possible, and if you had known, whether we as women might have thrived like moss, parts and parcels. Now, as we've traveled through day and night and through dayless, nightless dark, I've grown hints of you up my back, and I have not always known if it is a comfort or a burden. Perhaps it is both. It is no easy task. The trick is to keep the sips small, teeny tiny. 2. Remember when you said that the trauma of the old world was upon us? You were sitting on the kitchen floor, shoes kicked off, hair draped over your knees. You looked small, devastated. Remember how the days blurred, slow, and then quick. The fires, the raids, that moment when we thought we'd be safe, but then heat, drought, lockdown, poisoned atmosphere, the new regime. For years, we lived inside the house without you, the larder stocked with canned vegetables, old processed food. Sai taught me all the survival skills he could remember from basic, but mostly we kept to ourselves. The shock of it all too hard to communicate. I'd sit for hours in what muted light broke through blackout curtains and try to understand. I'd call it memory, like medicine, lying in the tall grass, the sun on my face before exposure was too dangerous. The headaches were intense. My forehead felt as if it were splitting open, exposing me to something. Many years passed. People died. You died. Then, one day, a knock at the door. 3. I write to you from the present, Mother. We sit together, you and I, here in this letter. Why me? I ask the driver about the crates. You needed feeding, she says. The driver and I are passing through fields of ash. The day's drive has gone hot, ruddy and broke open, spilling out. I grew crop here, the driver says, gesturing toward the burns. Barley, just last season. She says the word barley with such reverence. A loved one, now dead. Where are we going? I ask. To fertile soil, she says. Soon there will be river. Then the land will get very dry before we reach trees, then mountain, then beyond mountain. That is my hope. And others, I can't say. 4. We drive and drive until we finally come to river. The driver and I run barefoot down the revetment and plunge our faces into water. Here, the air is clean, but the river is dirty. Even so, we drink until we are overfull. We sit on the edge of the concrete slope, thinking together now, trying to define this sudden expansion. The road, the river. We cannot touch the word for our condition. It is too vast. The driver becomes sick. She leans over and vomits water onto the pavement. The water is a small pond, and in the pond are tadpoles and snails and black LG bottle caps slicked with half memories and pain. I take up some of the water in my hands and watch the driver's story swirl with my own. Thank you, I say to the stories in the water that are not just our stories, but also living creatures, the algae and the tadpoles, creatures with stories all their own. Thank you, I say to the driver, still ill. I am grateful that we are here together. I can see the acorn flush of her face peeking, sick with grief, and she sees me, sees my own story, sees the girl leaning against moss walls as spores grow up all around her. Memory makes what it needs to make, the artist once said at a talk. Remember when talks used to happen? I remember looking at you in the mirror, looking back at me, looking at you. You were wearing cream-colored nylons. You prodded at your pinched skin and said, no matter what you try to suck in, something will always spill out. You showed me magazine images of women's bodies. This is the difference between real and airbrushed, you said. I couldn't focus. I imagined some man doing the impossible, painting the air. But, or maybe because of that, it was a lesson that stuck in me and grew. Here's what I want to tell you about travel. First, you have to find the right partner. That person should be resolute and know when and when not to talk. They should embrace change because just when you think you understand the vehicle, it changes. And just when you understand your partner, they will change. And the river will change, and our insides will change, and it will make us sick, and then maybe we will be well if just for a moment before becoming unwell again. And that is the whole process in a nut. The secret to travel is pacing. Sip slowly. Another lesson I have learned is that you should choose a person and put your faith not in that person, but in how you move and how you sit still together. It won't feel as it felt before, but no matter. This is not any indicator of rightness or wrongness. Watch. Can you see it? How the gaze sits, leaps. I will also say that traveling is not as easy as it used to be. Sometimes the driver and I are traveling in a truck, sometimes a helicopter, sometimes something else entirely. The vehicle changes as we change. It does not run on gasoline or diesel or electricity. It is something we call truck or helicopter, for lack of a better word. The important thing is that we are together, moving. Let it go, says the driver. I let the pond drain back down into the river, but lovingly. The tadpoles grow into frogs as they swim away. What remains of the story? Glints, traces. Once the sun has faded and our lungs have fully absorbed the clean air, we lace up our leather boots and head to the car. The driver gets into the passenger seat. There is no other option. I drive. Five. I drive and drive far away from the river and past what used to be a city. Charred buildings, burnt-out vehicles, piles and piles of sheet metal and broken brick. I'm all car as we speed through the remains. Outside, the land grows flat and dry. I gradually return to myself. The driver slumps in the passenger seat. She releases a long moan that fills the car with a dark cloud of debris. Ash, the dust of shell and bone, bottle caps again and always. The cloud is not the same as the pond. This grief seems old, ancient. I do not know why she suffers or how long it will consume her. I watch the dark air circulate, spiral and speckle the inside of the car. It is not so awful to sit with her in this swirl once I realize that her grief is a type of loving. The project of breathing the dark air does not take long for me to learn, but it is hard to stay focused on the road. The drive stretches on, and I am unsure when or if the driver will go back to driving. I fear I may not be strong enough or wise enough to know how to keep going. All this smoke and debris make for terrible headaches. When the driver and I first fled, she was prepared. The truck was full of what we might need: sleeping bags, backpacks complete with pocket knives, gloves, first aid supplies, not much water, but plenty of seed, some crates of food, apples, rhubarb, squash, endive, and leeks. I was frightened, hesitant, but the driver had the confidence of a comet. Now our supplies have dwindled and our vehicle has shrunk. The driver has finally fallen asleep. My headache is awful, but I can still think. And so I think of you, of course. Often I think of how I failed you. Look around. There is nowhere to hide in the desert except maybe in a car full of smoke. Breathe. Sip. In moments of exposure, think of a river. I draw up the river in my mind, and that leads me to the river long ago, which leads me to the green grasses where you sat, cradling me, nursing. Birth was at once a miracle and pedestrian. A baby was born, an old woman crossed a parking lot with plastic bags of produce dangling from her wrists. Acres of old growth were cut down for a highway. Another baby was born. But when I think, which is all I can do here in this vehicle, I think about how you made me from your body, and then your body made food, and you nursed me from your body. And I drank in one easy stream until I was full, and when I was full, you placed me naked on the grass, and the grass grew. And it was home for the insects, and it was food for the snails. And when the grass was full, it released air for every living thing that breathed. And I grew, and you loved me as I changed. And when the world was falling apart and you struggled to breathe, I did not care for you as I could have, because I did not know how, or I did not take the time to learn what caring for you meant. And what I mean to say now, in this silent, smoke-filled car with this grieving person next to me, sleeping, is that I am sorry for every casual or not so casual way I have harmed you. The sun sets and I drive within the muck of the cloud. The driver and I breathe out and breathe in. The sun rises. The dark debris in the air settles into dust on the dashboard. My headache dulls into softer, grayer tones. The driver blinks. Her whole being reminds me of a feather. Look, she says. A gray, jagged line cuts into the sky, and the sky cuts into the road, and the road into us. My chest peels open and gasps. Let's not be hasty, the driver says. We go quiet, pretending not to hope. Still, I say the word loud and clear inside my head. Mountain.
I love this quote you have, observing is one way to go on. And I think that's such an interesting line in a novel that is, working with a survival narrative, and what role kind of these observations that maybe don't always get noticed play a role in helping the characters survive and kind of make their way through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, memory and how these characters sort of are interrupted by their grief and sort of the traumas that they lived through as they keep going forward. It's interruptions that in some cases are that come up sort of naturally in the process of surviving, but then there are also these interruptions that are brought in where the narrator is like drawing up memory, like medicine is one part from the passage that I read. So it's actually acting as a way of finding little pockets of joy and memorial, I guess, in their own ways. So yeah, and I think that in terms of the grief that they're both experiencing, there's the grief that the narrator for her mother is something that's very present throughout the whole book, and it's a grief for sort of relatives and lineage, and the grief that the driver is experiencing is something that's much more ambiguous. It's an older, more accumulated, I guess, grief that has happened over time. So how she grieves looks very different. So there's the section where there's the exhaling the dark smoke of the memory and the grief, and it just takes on sort of that atmospheric quality of being released from the body. Where the narrator is talking through a lot of the grief, and that's part of her process, the driver's way of grieving is more of this exhaling or release of the body in ways that don't necessarily involve words. And both seem like something that is really important for them to do in conjunction with their journey forward, I guess. So there's a journey backwards and a journey forward at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's such an elegant move, that there's such a practical sense of like memory can be extremely vital to just a survival situation, right? If you know the right, uses for plants or, places to travel or whatnot. But there's so much nuance to, that memories can be laced with pain, or memory can be a survival tool in itself if you're drawing up kind of those moments of joy in the face of grief. So that's one of the things in reading your book. It feels so, I'm so appreciative of it and what you're able to do in this current moment, because it feels like so many of these moves of like survival is paired with kind of memory, and survival is paired with a very heightened emotional state that I think in the history of a lot of speculative fiction we haven't seen that so far. So I'm also curious for you, as you were writing these characters, were you thinking a lot in terms of kind of emotional arcs that they were experiencing? I know there's like many layers to it of just like the kind of action and the sequencing of what's happening to them and where they're moving towards. But I think I'm just so curious to hear more about the skillfulness in which you're able to draw out the emotionality of survival situations and loss situations as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that as I was working on the early drafts of this, I was thinking through what is the relationship between the personal grief and the sort of the larger the larger grief for like a culture, for like the land, like an ecological grief, and I think in the process of thinking through that, did start to realize also sort of the lineage, as you were saying, speculative, like the lineage of this literary tradition, especially with like the post-apocalyptic, novel. And so, I went back and reread some of my favorite post-apocalyptic books. So Parable of the Sower was one, and Ice by Anna Kavan was another. And I was also sort of in reviewing those and thinking through those books and the relationship that they might have with the larger genre of the post-apocalyptic tale, and where Sift is situated in that. There were certain things about those books that I really wanted to also include. So I think, I think I knew that this wasn't going to be like a straightforward linear narrative. So, there were like these three temporalities in the book: the forward moving narrative, the backward moving narrative, the memories, and then also these short sections threaded throughout that are atemporal and kind of existing a little bit outside of this linear narrative. And I was thinking also about the relationship between individual and collective, but in a way that is maybe not so much tied to like collective of humanity necessarily, and more of the sort of interspecies and relationships, and then also the relationship with your with the environment. So with the two characters, there's their relationship to each other, the two main characters in this book, but then there is that constant sort of interest in the outside world, and not only just to survive, but also especially with the narrator's case, and being sort of educated by the driver on the environment. So she's kind of learning in new ways as well. So yeah, I knew that I wanted to, I guess, engage with a narrative that had, even despite all of this, despair and chaos and grief, that there were these moments where the sense of hope gets threaded throughout, I guess. And those moments of hope really, I think, are in these short sections throughout that are non-human, that aren't really attached to the human-driven narrative. And so that I was looking to sort of other models outside of the post-apocalyptic genre for that. I was thinking a lot about, other sort of ecofeminist writers and narratives as well.
Well, I know you said Gathering Moss was an influence, correct?
Yeah, so I was also reading some nonfiction during that time. So Gathering Moss by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and trying to understand. So even though all of the environment is, a fictionalized environment, I still was researching, the white sand deserts in New Mexico for one section of the book. So yeah, there were the influences were not I guess just some of the post-apocalyptic books, but also some nonfiction, and some of the influences as I was drafting it are directly referenced in the book. So there are quotes from Anne Carson's lecture on corners. There are moments where some of my great-grandmother's poems are sort of excerpted. Unpublished poems are included in the book. There's like a section where some of these old recordings from a 1968 radio interview with Dolores Huerta. So all of these just other voices found their ways into it too. There was also a quote from Toni Morrison's "No Place for Self-Pity, No Room for Fear," that essay she wrote for The Nation. So yeah, I think there were lots of like a variety of influences. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like what's so beautiful, if we're talking about a survival story, I mean, so much of that hinges on the question of like, well, what is surviving or not surviving? And I love how you're taking such a wide scope with that, like you mentioning these, like this whole range of kind of text and voices on one hand that you're incorporating in the literary sense, but also with those interstitial segments where it's like, well, maybe our narrator won't survive, but the barrel cactus might, right? Mm-hmm. You know, it's taking it so beyond the human realm and kind of the societal realm without neglecting that aspect as well. I just find it so, I know as I was reading it, like I love the fact that this narrator is kind of like constantly, there's such a repetition of like, oh, we're not going to make it. And I remember reading it and being like, I don't know. They don't think they're going to make it, but there's like 50 more pages left. Something's got to happen. And it reminded me of that Samuel Beckett quote from The Unnameable, where it's, you know, you must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. So I love this idea of like this kind of impossible, like doing the impossible, right? And just kind of in the face of what feels unbearable is actually we're seeing two people bear what seem to be really impossible circumstances. Yeah. I mean, how were you thinking about kind of how much pressure, I guess, to put on these characters in terms of the situations you were placing them in?
Yeah, I think that that there were these moments where I felt compelled to give them what they needed, and there are other moments when I felt compelled to make it so difficult. And as I was drafting, it's interesting you'd say that they're, you know, when they say they can't go on and then they do go on. And I think in the drafting process, that's how it really is how it went. And I wanted to preserve that because that's how it feels, I think, often in life. And I also think that, you know, when we're thinking about these, you know, giant subjects like the current climate crisis, or, you know, like systemic racism, or, you know, like patriarchy and capitalism. Like when we're thinking about these things, it feels it's almost, I hear this a lot from people where it's overwhelming. It's just too overwhelming to really discuss or engage with. And I think this was sort of maybe the larger project of Sift ends up being like kind of what I think a larger project of a lot of other fiction that I'm really drawn to during times of crisis. And it's a way in which the story can contain the bigness of something like the climate crisis, and it invites all of these intersections and multiple versions of truth and sort of messiness that you get in life. And I think within that container of the narrative, we and I have had this experience, have been able to sort of locate my own agency in the story and have been moved to discuss and moved to act. And so this is where I think like the role of fiction and, you know, like what is the role of fiction, or with prose or poetry, literature, let's just say literature, and, you know, with regard to like the climate crisis, for example, is I think in some cases it helps to helps readers at least I've had this experience where I've become more expansive. I've been able to sort of see how there are these interconnections in ways that I don't always see when I'm just surviving and trying to live my life. And so it helps me to expand and go on.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned to me that you had someone tell you that your book helped them process grief from the pandemic, correct? Mm-hmm. And you've had your publishers calling it speculative epic.
Lyric
epic, right. And
speculative
it's also
lyric, yeah.
been called mythopoetic, right? Mm-hmm. And on the page, when we look at it, there's so much space. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to me that I find it actually very respectful, I guess is the word I would choose, that it's such a big story and there's a lot of weight to the story, and you're able to achieve that in about 100 pages, which to me is only something to just praise completely. It seems so respectful to me that not only is it a story where our characters are facing grief and kind of this unbearable weight of circumstances, but as readers too, right, we're able to kind of sip through the book and have the space to kind of fill ourselves into the story. And there are those gaps that to me feel very reflective of kind of the losses and like the breathing room that's so necessary to be able to just be able to endure those things. So I guess I'm curious, with the form, were you always thinking of it as this kind of spacious on the page book, or were you always thinking of it as, kind of more in the novella size, or did it morph a lot as you were crafting it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the sense of space was always there from the beginning. It felt to me, like early on, it could be a prose poem, and then it ended up expanding, and including a lot more of these different elements. And I wasn't quite sure what it was, but it began actually as a sort of as letters, written to a mother who has died, and I ended up changing as I was drafting it. It became clear that this character had so much more to say, and it wasn't just to the mother. And actually, a lot of what they were saying was this kind of strange way of going on. So it's she is addressing her mother throughout, especially during like the very heightened moments, and it's really a way of her kind of talking herself through those hard times, even and bringing her mother along with her. So it's, I think, maybe less lonely in these ways. But yeah, it began as these letters. So it was more like this epistolary story at first, and then it just kind of evolved into more of a narrative and not like these direct letters. It was more of like, almost like the character was writing letters in her mind to her mother or something. But I think that the spaciousness was important too, because of the time when I started writing this was at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I felt very blocked. I wasn't able to write anything else, and I started just writing in the early mornings in a more therapeutic way about some of my biggest fears. And I was just doing a lot of pausing and breathing and like looking around and taking in, my backyard, and then going back to the page. And so it felt to me like I was doing it, so it worked its way into the book itself. And of course, not all of those remained, but it ends up being in the final drafts, it ended up being a kind of rhythm. It ended up informing the rhythm of the whole story. So I think the other part is that I kind of knew that it was going to be this story where there was going to be some violence and there was going to be some grief and a lot of heavy topics. And I wanted the narrator to have a voice that was sort of calm, like paced, like a kind of a slow pace, as a way of it making it maybe more sort of absorbable for the reader, I guess, is like we have a narrator who at least can invite some of that calm during the chaos. The tone, the different rhythms and tones invite that kind of calmness, I guess.
Yeah, the contrast between the narrator and the driver is interesting just in terms of kind of tone and personality. And I think the fact that we're so focused on, that's I guess the primary relationship that we're seeing play out, but it also kind of nods to so much more relation going on in the environment. Like you said, like the letters to someone who's not there, and also just like this idea of kind of perceived relations and like how that can be its own kind of survival strategy of like kind of conjuring up maybe like the absent figure, but it's such a helpful tool for the narrator in terms of maybe retaining a sense of self or a sense of the past in the face of loss. I'm so curious when you were crafting the driver and the narrator and kind of what that relationship was going to be like, were you making a lot of changes, or were you pretty clear on like how they might play off of each other, or what was kind of your thought as you started forming that?
Yeah, I think I approach character in this way. I guess in The Art of the Novel, Mulan Kundera talks about the character as being not like a simulation of a person, but instead being a experimental self. But it has maybe sometimes, like human qualities, but is less interested in it, sort of creating the reality of a human, and more interested in the concept. And so with these characters, I think of them, like more of a collection of sensibilities and ideas and all, sort of, and I think this is where sort of the mythos of this world kind of comes in, is that they like the vehicle is evolving and changing throughout, and so it poses a particular challenge for me as the writer, because there's constantly having to try to define these things for the reader so that it's understood. But I think that what I realized in, like the second, third drafts, and started understanding the two characters better, is that the narrator character, what was most important for her is it was relational, like learning what she could through her relationship with the driver and her relationship with the land, and trying to sort of rethink a lot of narratives that she inherited, and sort of realizing there were these different ways to survive, I guess, to go on. And the driver helps her with this, but there's a lot that she has to do, like in terms of her own grief and her own sort of interior struggle. And so that comes up in, sort of these strange ways. We can, as readers, recognize that she's a human type, character, but there's also these strange things that I allow to happen, right? And because it somehow, to me, expresses an emotional truth, and that is where my agency is expressing the emotional truth over the trying to define this character in a sort of static way, so they seem real, if that makes sense. Yeah. Focus, I guess the detailing goes more into the emotional truths that are coming up, and less into what the the everyday sort of nuances of that character and their personality and what they look like and all of those kind of things. At least with this project, that's how it's been. And then with the driver, they evolve in so many different ways. So the driver starts out, and then there's a fracturing in the middle of the book where the driver becomes many. And so there's a moment, maybe I can find this, but, where her character takes on, a multiplicity. Here's the section. They hand me some of the seeds, small and dry. They smile, a series of smiles, lamellae. I realize this is their name. They are many, many ages, many genders, ghosts, ideas. So there's just this moment where the character is named, it's just understood what their name is, and that also it's not one that they that they are these they contain these many aspects here. So that was a surprise in the drafting process, I guess. I didn't realize that was going to happen, and then it did. And in the early stages, I allowed for it. And then after all that material was generated, I took some time to think through sort of the philosophy of the book, really what I wanted to highlight, and what I felt like was most important. And so there were certain things that I realized they were too strange. They didn't really go with the story. I pulled them out. But then there were other things that felt very much the part of the project and the characters that stayed in. So, certain kind of fracturing of identity and the sort of mutability of their relationship too, is that's something else that's kind of evolving and changing throughout the book and having to be sort of renamed.
I so appreciate the strangeness. For me, it really brought up why I love Roadside Picnic, for example, with the vehicle, how you write it, and other books by the Strugatsky brothers, and also why I love Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation trilogy comes up so much when I read this as well. And whether or not that's, not to say those are overt references, but I find it a wonderful next step in this constellation of kind of weird and wild and strange, and how that connects to kind of speculative fiction and survival and kind of whether we're going to call it eco-apocalyptic, how negative we're going to get with it. But I just think that's such a vital element to include, where it's there is the doom, there is the gloom, but there is also the bizarre, the truly bizarre that emerges from things fracturing and splintering and kind of having to combine in new ways. So I think, that is such a kind of crucial inclusion, just with any work that is actually going to try to really fully kind of look at these topics. It's the hybridization and real, like what adaptation forces you into creates really new kind of unprecedented scenarios, and kind of life emerges in new and unexpected ways. I wonder for you, like, were there moments where you were feeling like it was, like, was it enjoyable to kind of write that weirdness into the book? Was that something that was really important to you, or were there moments where you're like worried about getting too weird with it? Just kind of, I guess, as you're imagining your readership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking in the revising process a lot about inherited narratives, and I think like sort of the difference between like passive and active ways in which sort of narrative it kind of other narratives interrupt the writing process. So I was thinking about, what parts in the story seem familiar to me, a little too familiar, a little bit too much like the shape that I'm used to with storytelling. And oftentimes for me, what that means is, that I'm writing in a passive way, where there is some kind of absorbed narrative that I, at some point through, family or culture or something, it ends up on the page. And so it's a big part of my drafting process is interrogating, those parts that seem maybe a little familiar. And that could be, the content, but a lot of times it has to do with form too. Like, why am I writing in this form? Is this the right form for this story? And so that was something I was thinking through. There were other kinds of sort of moments of insertion of other like narratives, like what I said earlier about, my like poetry of my grandmother's, and, the other books that I've been reading, or articles that I've been reading at the time. There were these moments when I was writing where I thought, there needs to be another voice, basically. I think that it would be important for this to be more sort of polyvocal. And so I just sort of allowed for all of that and recognized that it was going to be this weird, strange thing, and was lucky enough to find a publisher that really has made it their mission to publish what they call necessary alternatives. And I think of a necessary alternative as something as, art that is sort of outside of mainstream entertainment. It is often, intersectional, interdisciplinary, multimedia, and it is, a lot of the works that they publish experiment with form in really exciting new novel ways. And so when I came upon this press, I thought, well, if this weird story is going to find a home, it might be here. So I think that was a great gift, and I was able to have a lot of conversations with the editors about about the shape and the sort of sequencing and the different ways that that this story can be seen, basically. I really had to work through some of my like larger thoughts about narrative and about writing to be able to take the next step with revision with them, and I'm really grateful for that. And so yeah, I think that was a very supportive moment to have. But I will say one more thing. With the early drafts, there were a number of, very confused readers.
As there will be.
Yeah.
Well, and I love these interstitial kind of poetic parts throughout, and I'm so thankful to see, both your impulse to write the book in this way, and also that it survived into the final form. Would you want to read maybe a selection of these, because they're so beautiful, and there's such a interesting break for us as readers in terms of not only kind of rhythm and tone, but also they are kind of a motif of a lot of the natural world really kind of coming much more into focus frequently.
Sure. Pond snail. Homish. Back heavy with spiral shell, the swell of life shimmering. Nearby river. Nearby beard of black algae. Belly slick over rock, slick slide over stone, the warm stone, earth vibrating. Slide belly stone, belly vibrating, a slim line. A slime line curved over stone. The spiral shape finds shelter at the center. Slide over and under and into what some might call sleep. Sadness is here, but it's not all. Slide away, out of view, far from capture. The curvy wet line turns to shimmer. Western banded gecko slips into darkness between two stones and waits. Green eyes blink away light. Waits in trapped heat. Waits in layer of neck, layer of torso, layer of tail, loose. A gust of sand blows. Clay, bedrock, crust. Blink, blink. Teeth tear dead skin from body. Body swallows the dead skin self. Waits. A tiny tooth falls from a mouthful of tiny teeth. An uncertain birth. Peels toes from the rock surface. Climbs back into light. Wild mustard. The flowering weed is going to seed. Pod clusters round and smooth, dark purple-brown. Hairs on the lower mid-vein of the pinnatifid leaves. Scent of clover, of pepper, ancestor of kale, ancestor of cabbage, ancestor of Swiss chard, of cauliflower, of turnip. A family before there was language for family. Everything related. Taproot thin, but hardy, in frost, in drought. Cloud debris. Light against light, and light in air. Light on light voice. A fragile air made of ash. Bottle cap memory burn. Light and floating. Dead voice. Light on light voice. Crushed bone voice. Voice that is light and light that is ever shifting. How to survive. How to survive ash, how to survive smoke, how to survive light ever shifting, how to live inside bone dust. Pepto. Any neglect, any pink residue, any scrap or rot or rubble or waste, supposing the echo of flux, melt, minty scent fading. Suppose the swill evaporates. Suppose dilapidation, bulbous. Suppose the edges soften into dirt patterns. Suppose the song of chalk written in rivers. Suppose a plastic meadow, semi-permanent neglect. Suppose a breakdown, a lost libretto for debris. Barrel cactus, midday windstorm, a spiky ribbed plant with a crown of fine spines. Gust of wind, sand skitters across sand. Beetles scrape softly. Light warms every surface. Then the winds die down. The bugs stop digging. A ripple in the air. Silent, hot. Very few survive. Pond. Dead things float on the surface, but underneath the weeds sway. Tiny minnows swim through feathery green fronds. Sands shift. Fish the color of ink sip-kiss the sediment. A swirling shell slinks over gray and purpled stones. Minnows, all glass and entrails. The green creature dives headfirst into ground, then shoots up and skids across the top like it might be eating bits of debris. Floats there, bobs. Riverweed sways. The skin of the water reflects another world. Cosmos. Be planted, tethered, rooted. Be still, still and straight, face toward the sun. Let the warm rays soak at the edges. Be leaves uncurling, open, light. Be petal, then wind, then a chill moon glow. Be shifting from below, roots stretching with other roots, insects burrowing. Be raindrops, dirt expanding, breathing. Be roots drinking in the sunshine for joy stretch. Then be as the earth contracts, tight at the roots, warm, then too warm, then parched. Be thirsty, then cool. Be rustling, petals, vibrations, then in the air, tiny buzzing. Be the sweetness that sound produces, the scent of nectar, strong, powdery, earthy, and blooming. Be inside the buzz, here now, there, the earth shifts.